Welcome to Illuminated Infamy's Thursday Deep Dive. Today, we look into the marriage of Roald Dahl and Patricia Neal. Sit back, grab a beverage, or maybe a snack, and we'll begin to tell this fascinating and tragic tale. In February of 1965, a series of strokes left Patricia Neal in a coma, unable to speak or walk, and doctors gave her almost no chance of a normal life again. The man who pulled her back from that, through sheer relentless will, was already the same man who would spend the next decade keeping a secret from her, one that ended their marriage anyway. By 1965, Patricia Neal had already lived the kind of career most actresses only dream about. She broke through on Broadway in her early 20s, winning a Tony Award for Lillian Hellman's Another Part of the Forest. Then she moved to Hollywood, where a tempestuous years-long relationship with Gary Cooper began. It was a time that left her with a private loss she rarely discussed publicly. In 1953, she married the British author Roald Dahl, and the two settled into a quiet home in the English countryside. By the mid-1960s, Dahl's children's books were just beginning to reshape his career, and the family was growing. But the marriage had already survived tragedy long before the stroke entered the picture. In 1960, their infant son Theo suffered a severe brain injury when his stroller was struck by a taxi on a Manhattan street. The accident left him with hydrocephalus, a condition that threatened his life and future. Roald Dahl refused to accept the standard treatment available at the time. He worked directly with a hydraulic engineer and a pediatric neurosurgeon to help design an entirely new kind of shunt valve. This innovative invention was later used in hospitals treating thousands of children worldwide. 2 years after that, in 1962, their daughter Olivia died of complications from measles encephalitis at just 7 years old. This loss devastated both parents and permanently changed how Dahl saw the world. By the time Neal, pregnant with their 5th child, collapsed from a ruptured aneurysm in February 1965, Dahl had already spent years learning exactly how far he was willing to go to keep his family intact. He had learned how hard he was willing to push a medical system to save those he loved. He was about to do it again. The strength of their bond would become a legendary testament to human endurance. Neal spent 3 weeks in a coma. When she woke, she had lost her speech, lost her mobility, and lost use of much of the right side of her body. Several of her doctors did not expect her to survive the initial strokes at all, and those who did largely assumed she would never work again. They assumed she would possibly never fully communicate again. Rather than accept the standard rehabilitation, Dahl built his own recovery program from scratch. He hired a speech therapist and organized friends and neighbors into rotating shifts, having them drill Neal for hours nearly every single day. They engaged in repetitive speech and physical exercises. By most accounts, it was brutal. Dahl reportedly mocked her mistakes on purpose and refused to accept slurred half-answers. He was deliberately provoking the kind of frustration and anger that might force real words out of her when gentler methods hadn't. Doctors who had initially dismissed his amateur program as reckless began slowly to concede that something about it was working. Neal regained her speech. She regained much of her mobility. And within a few years, she was acting again. In 1968, she earned an Academy Award nomination for The Subject Was Roses, a comeback so dramatic it made international news. This occurred in a year the Best Actress race famously ended in a tie between two other legends. But the same intensity that rebuilt Neal's body did not switch off once the crisis passed. Those close to the family described Dahl's grip over the household, the finances, and eventually Neal's own career choices as growing tighter. His control grew tighter, not looser, in the years after her recovery. The night of the ceremony, Neal did not expect to win. Barbra Streisand and Katharine Hepburn had already tied for Best Actress that year, an outcome so rare it had happened only once before in Academy history. Most of the room assumed the real story of the evening belonged to them. But when Neal's name was read as a nominee, and she appeared on stage to present another award, still recovering full command of her speech, less than 3 years removed from a stroke that had left her unable to talk at all, the audience rose to its feet before she said a single word. Actors, directors, people who had known her for 20 years, and people who had only read about her recovery in the papers. They stood and applauded for nearly a full minute. Neal later said it was the first moment she truly understood what her own comeback had meant to people who weren't in the room drilling her. The press ran with it. Magazine profiles cast the Dahls as the marriage that had survived the impossible. A devoted husband who had rebuilt his wife from nothing through sheer will, and a wife who had come back from the edge of losing everything to work again at the highest level of her profession. It became one of the defining love stories of 1960s Hollywood, repeated in interviews for years, held up as proof that marriage could survive anything. It was, at the exact same time, already becoming untrue. Sometime in the early 1970s, Dahl began a relationship with Felicity and Crosland, a family friend who had grown close to the household. By most accounts, the affair stretched on for roughly a decade, conducted in plain enough sight that the village knew long before Neal did. Patricia Neal later described the years leading up to the discovery as feeling like the last person in her own life to learn the truth. In 1988, in her autobiography, As I Am, she finally wrote about the betrayal candidly, describing a marriage that had quietly hollowed out. Then, in 1983, 2 collapses arrived within months of each other. A magazine piece Dahl wrote drew widespread public accusations of anti-Semitism and did lasting damage to his literary reputation. And the marriage, 30 years in, finally ended in divorce. Dahl married Crosland shortly afterward. Neal kept working for decades afterward, in film and television, and became one of the most visible public advocates for stroke recovery in the country, eventually lending her name to a rehabilitation center in Tennessee that still treats patients today. She died in 2010 at 84. Dahl, for his part, spent his later years publicly campaigning for childhood measles vaccination, citing Olivia's death as the reason. The same relentless capacity for action turned, this time, entirely toward good. That's the part of this story that resists a clean read. The same will that very likely saved Patricia Neal's ability to speak, walk, and work again was inseparable from the same controlling instinct that helped destroy their marriage from the inside. And the same force that helped save other people's children was inseparable from the man who spent a decade lying to his own wife. The world remembers Roald Dahl as a writer of gentle mischief for children. Patricia Neal's story and Olivia's and Theo's are the clearest evidence that the man behind those books carried something far harder underneath, and that the people closest to him paid for it first. In the years after the divorce, Neal and Dahl settled into an uneasy civility for the sake of the children still living between 2 households. They spent holidays in the same rooms without pretending the wounds had closed. Dahl married Crosland that same year and spent much of his final decade continuing the causes his family's tragedies had pushed him toward, campaigning publicly for childhood vaccination and quietly staying connected to hydrocephalus research through the circles that had built Theo's valve years earlier. He died in 1995, years after Neal published her memoir, As I Am, the book that finally forced much of the public to reconsider the story they thought they already knew, the recovery without the cost hidden behind it. Neal, for her part, never stopped working. She took smaller film and television roles well into her 70s, was honored repeatedly by stroke foundations and rehabilitation centers across the country, and in interview after interview insisted that the same brutal, uncompromising method that rebuilt her speech was also the only reason she survived the stroke at all. Whether that made Dahl's methods forgivable, she never fully resolved, not in the memoir, and not in the decades of interviews that followed it. She died in 2010 at 84 having outlived Dahl by 20 years, and having spent that time building a public identity almost entirely separate from the marriage that once defined her to the world.